It's a perfect setup now for the Science Advisory co-chair with me, Dr. John Battles from University of California, Berkeley, who's a forest ecology professor. So we've heard about the diversity, Ramona, and fire and climate change. We've heard about fire use. We've heard about the importance of water, community impact. Now John's going to show us how we can, how you actually can use some of the resources in the regional resource kits for Northern California to grapple with these issues and consider and plan and implement projects to reduce risk to these ecosystems and communities of your region. Dr. Battles.
Thank you, Steve. Great, so it's really a pleasure to be here to introduce the Northern California Regional Resource Kits. Again, specific information for this region of the world. All right, just next slide. Can you do that for me? Thank you. So as Steve mentioned, the scientists are all in on helping this task force. And our charge was, in terms of going faster and going bigger, is to pull the information together, to make it accessible, and to make sure it crosses jurisdictions. Wildfires don't care about county boundaries. Drought doesn't care whether it's federal, private, or tribal land. And therefore, our data, the information, has to cross boundaries. So as my colleague Mike Goulden says, we need to get that information wall to wall. And that was our charge. And we see the secretary and we see the regional forester here, and they're super nice and gregarious and super pleasant people, but they don't get to be leaders without holding us accountable. And that's where you get that feedback from a scientist with, oh my gosh, we have a deadline that we can't miss. And so we've been trying to live up to that deadline and go with the pace and scale of the task force. Next slide, please. This, again, I want to just give a shout out to what we've called the Regional Resource Kit Interagency Science Team. These members is all part of our job to some extent, but the level of commitment and intellectual energy to get these versions out today, and our version 1.0, they're going to get better, it still was a big lift, and none of us expected 18 months ago of really what we're getting into. So I just want to acknowledge our team members and colleagues and sort of appreciate their effort. There's Pat Manley, there's Mike Goulden, Tadashi Moody, Carol Clark, and then of course Peter Stein, who's been the project manager for this effort, and I really just want to appreciate their effort. And then the collegiality of meeting deadlines and again, trying to work through these issues going forward. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk about, we fit into this resource kit, we think of it as the wheel. We're really focused on two aspects. I'm going to talk about the metrics, and then later on I'm going to talk about how you can use those metrics to do assessments and set priorities. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of what you've heard a lot about this, the natural resources of this region, that's the sort of the huge value of these resources. We have really unique and some of the most intact salmonid resources on the map on the left, and we have a lot of forest cover here, the classic big tree forest of California here. So this is really a resource-rich area. But one of our charges was to pull this together in a comprehensive package, to get information that is both scientifically rigorous but also management relevant. It does not matter if we scientists think we have the greatest thing since sliced bread if the managers don't believe and use it. At the same time, we don't want managers to use information that's not robust. So it really is this balance between management relevance and scientific integrity. At the same time, we also want things at a 30-meter scale, and we want it at a sort of a time frame where it can be updated as things change. So we really focused on data that we had at that 30-meter scale, and that could be updated potentially annually. And so you can see that here, really valuable, not just to know that there's a lot of resources in this area, but where are they? Where are the hotspots? Where are the concentrations to inform planning going forward? Next slide, please. As we've heard before, the northern region here provides enormous ecosystem services to the state. The water sources here are just incredibly important. But again, in this map on the left, you can see where are those hotspots? Where is that water really being produced? At the same time, these forests also store an enormous amount of carbon that helps California meet its greenhouse gas emission criteria. And again, you can look on this map and figure out where they are. So when you're planning treatments in your particular region, you know where these resources are. Next slide, please. At the same time, we've been hearing about this again and again. These resources, these services, these communities are under threat. They're threatened by, again, wildfire and drought. One of the key priority, sort of universal consensus among the scientific advisory panel is that if you're going to try and do one thing right now, what we need to do is prevent high severity fire. And that's what you see on this left map. What is the probability of high severity fire? We really want to prevent that really negative kind of fire coming on the landscape. We know fire is part of this landscape, but not high severity fire. At the same time, we also have a really big risk with all of these dense productive forests that are used to a lot of rainfall, the consequences of a drought. And we're really there. You can see a lot of high severity areas here that are at very high risk of drought. Next slide, please. And of course, again, we've been talking about the community impacts, that we really need to protect communities. This is a rural area, but it's a diverse area. It has a high concentration of indigenous peoples. And we get to think beyond just the direct risk of wildfire coming into communities, because wildfires in the region produce an enormous amount of smoke. And so this map on the right shows what's the potential for smoke production from a high severity fire. And you can see, again, a lot of these hot spots of high smoke line up on many of our communities in this region. And so you have to, again, think of those, not just the direct impacts of wildfire, but also these other consequences of wildfire as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's sort of, and I think we have 99 metrics for the North Coast. We're going to add probably one more in our revision coming up soon. So there's a lot of metrics here. How do you take those metrics and use them to assess and prioritize? Next slide, please. One of the great things we rolled out at the last meeting is the interagency treatment tracker system. So right now in this system, we have all the 222 projects up there, 2022 projects up there, and they're color coded. The key codes to think of is that red is beneficial fire, and blue is sort of hand or mechanical thinning. I picked two places in the northern region here to sort of think about it. One is Scotts Valley on the left. The other is Weaverville. You can see some similarities in the strategy and some differences. Again, one of the priorities here, we've heard about it from the Forest Service, is this wildfire crisis strategy. We need to protect communities from wildfire. And you see this in both Scotts Valley and Weaverville, where these treatments, these polygons, these spatially explicit polygons are showing you where the work was done in 2022. And you can see it sort of lining outside on the perimeters of these communities to prevent wildfire from the wildlands getting into the communities. But if you look at these, there's big differences. Why is Scotts Valley has a lot more beneficial fire? They're using prescribed fire to get that kind of fuel reduction. Where in Weaverville, you see a lot more of mechanical and hand thinning. So what are some of the reasons for that? Why might that be happening? Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of take you I'm going to walk you through sort of a Weaverville example, sort of a planning treatment. And again, I'm taking this from sort of an analytical point of view. I wasn't involved in designing these treatments. I'm looking at the data, trying to see, how does this work in sense of meeting some of these multiple priorities we have in the landscape. So here's Weaverville. We're looking at here. You can see as you look around Weaverville, there's a whole bunch of treatments, but most of these treatments are mechanical and hand thinning. I'm going to focus on, look at two of them, one in the upper left and one in the lower right, these two different regions. Next slide, please. So here's a map of this high severity fire, with the yellow being sort of the very high severity fire, the stuff you want to avoid. You can see within Weaverville proper, there's not much, but a lot of these mountainous areas around there do have them. And Weaverville, most of these treatments were either hand thinning, which is on the top, or mastication, which is that where we use that masticator on the bottom to sort of chow up small trees and fuel. So that's what mechanical and hand thinning means. So let's overlay the next slide, please. So here they're overlaid on top of this. And that one in the upper left is along a ridge line. It was done with mastication. It's clearly meant to be a fuel break to prevent fire from coming up over the ridge. The lower blob, the big block in the lower right, was against a whole slope. It started at the ridge and went down into the sort of the river bottom. Again, all hand treated, very carefully hand treated to kind of reduce the sort of wildfire hazard there. Next slide, please. This same region, it also happens to be really good high suitability habitat for the Pacific fisher. The Pacific fisher is a sensitive and threatened species. They have to come into the planning. We need to protect both our people and our habitats for wildlife. Ramona mentioned this earlier. You can see that almost surrounding Weaverville, not only do they have a lot of sort of fire risk, high severity fire risk, but also a lot of good Pacific fisher habitat. And some of these fuel treatments are not all that great for Pacific fisher population. So how do you manage those two trade-offs? Next slide, please. Again, here it is. Here are these same polygons of treatments placed on top of another metric, in this case, Pacific Fisher wild habitat suitability, and you can see it begins to give you some idea, at least when I'm looking at this, maybe in this region, this lighter touch, this sort of rather than using prescribed fire, let's go in there with hand thinning so we don't disturb the Pacific Fisher population so much. It might be a more acceptable way, a more reasonable way of doing it. That's just me looking at it. Now, one of the key things to think that this is just 2022, and this is roughly a 2020 sort of metrics. As we go forward, we're going to be able to put 2023 information on there. We're going to be able to put 2024. We're going to be able to start seeing how we assemble all of these different polygons. We can also, hopefully, we'll refresh this data so we can come back and see how effective was it? Have we started to change these things? Have we adversely affected Pacific Fisher habitat? Have we improved sort of the wildfire hazard situation there? So we have a lot of information going to local communities. We have differences. Scotts Valley approaches it differently from Weaverville. In my conversations this morning, I met a colleague who grew up in Weaverville, and she said, it might not have anything to do with Pacific Fisher, John. It might be the fact that Weaverville has been kind of traumatized by wildfire, and therefore they prefer to use mechanical and hand thinning. That's a totally legitimate way. That's part of what the task force is trying to do. We need to push these information. We want to give people information so they can make choices that fit for their community while also meeting these multiple objectives. And that's really the goal of this information going forward. And we're going to continue to build it and make it better as we go forward. We're committed to, we want your feedback, use the data. Next slide, please. Here's how you get it. But as you use it and find flaws, you want other things, please contact us, and we're committed to making it better. The task force is committing to continually making this better so that information is out there so we can meet our goals of pace and scale. Thank you.
We also realize we're holding you between lunch, and I'm a big guy. I don't like to miss lunch. That was outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Battles. This, I hope, so this is a toolkit. That QR code takes you to a toolkit. I will close by sharing that we recognize, and Julianne mentioned this, and I believe Patrick mentioned this as well, that we can't just put it on the web page and hope it gets used. We are assembling a team to come to you and where we will develop a workshop and work you through these resources so you can become familiar and more fluent with them. And when we've done this in the other regions, we've even provided lunch. So with that, I'm going to turn to you, Jen and Wade, and thank you all for having us.
Thanks so much. It's an incredible body of work you guys have created. The way I think about it is we need to do a lot of things to expand these projects to protect our communities and our landscapes. We need more funding. We need permit streamlining. We need enough bodies to do the work. But we also need the information that informs that. And I think when we were working over the last couple of years, we said, God, wouldn't it be a disaster if we're asking every local or regional group to come up with this information themselves? Everybody reinventing the wheel. This is a complicated situation. Better to identify, what we want these projects to do, and then identify the different, characteristics or dimensions of these landscapes. So the goal here is to have that one-stop shop for information. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't mean the work gets done. It doesn't even mean the work that gets done right, but it's a key component. And I'm really thankful to the Science Advisory Panel, of which you all serve on, for providing this. And as John said, it's a 1.0 version. And so to Steve's point, we want to understand how groups are using this and how they can use it better, and how we can package the information to use it better. Because we want it to be one less thing that local groups have to put together to actually get projects on the ground. Jen, any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, thanks. I agree. Just one less barrier that we can, relieve people of. So this is our fourth resource kit. So just really quickly, John or Steve particularly, any reflections from this past year and the other resource kits that have been out there that would be helpful for everybody who may be looking at using? Hopefully you guys go back and use this. Any advice, even as they launch into these resource kits now that they're available? Anything you would advise users?
Yeah, I mean, we've been a part of the kind of the work, not kind of, we have been involved in developing the workshops for the different entities to just become familiar with these things, right? Otherwise, you're just kind of handing a suitcase and you have no idea what the contents are. Here, we're actually sitting down with entities, letting them get familiar with them, work through scenarios, right? If this, then, what data would you go to? How would you interpret those data? And I've shared this before, Peter Stein and I drove up together. John and I have had this conversation. I've had it with Sherry Hazelhurst, Julianne. We all know that it's just as there was an interagency science team that was, all hands on deck to get this stuff going together on time consistently. We have to do the same thing to support these groups, right? And because these are some complex data and the interpretations are complex. They're usable, they're publicly available, you can get them now, but we want to continue that support. And those have been really well received. So we realize we've gotten to, where we've gotten to, it's like John says a lot, it's 1.0, and the data are going to continue to improve, but we also want to be there to support the groups in the long term. John?
And also, I just would point out as a field scientist, this does not replace the knowledge you have on the ground. It's meant to help and guide, but not replace. And so we know that people know their forests, they know their landscapes, and we just want to help them put it into a larger content and go faster, as the Secretary and Regional Foresters say. We want to remove one less barrier.
Perfect.
Let me just make a really quick point on that, because we do hear from people throughout the state. We know what we're doing. We know where the high priority landscapes are. Just write us checks. I mean, people literally are saying that. There's a lot of money out there. What I hope people could understand from this is it'll not only help you better prioritize and plan projects, but it gives us information to help the money keep rolling. It's not enough for you to hear you've treated a high priority project. We want to know is, what are the carbon storage benefits? What are the water benefits? What's the reduction in fire risk? We're hearing from everybody. Please get beyond acres treated. So a whole nother benefit of these tools is giving us and giving the federal side and appropriators. If you give us another $1 billion, here's what we're going to get in terms of safer communities, more carbon storage, more biodiversity. Once we add this stuff up, it'll be a powerful tool, not just for you, but for us to go to Congress and the legislature to say, your money is working and here's how it's working. So I just want to make sure that you folks keep in mind that it's working both ways, planning and prioritizing, but also reporting, because we do have joint accountability here. We're willing to go regional, but you got to demonstrate that you can handle us going regional and can generate the information to help sell a continued regional approach as we move forward. So thank everybody for helping with that.
And Patrick, maybe the last comment before we break for lunch is, by going regional, the notion is getting funding into the regions, and then the regional leaders and groups are deciding where that funding is made. The traditional approach is for somebody in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. to look through hundreds of projects and then to pick the specific projects in each place. We don't think that works well because, one, as I said, we don't know these landscapes as well as local groups do, but then also we want to develop this pipeline of projects and scale up those projects that can happen. And if it's somebody in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. picking every specific project, it's not going to work. So to Patrick's point, the benefit of this information is it helps us report on the outcomes of each of these projects, which is really, really important. And by having a one-stop shop for information, you're not spending months trying to identify what your projects will do. You're actually using this information to spit out information about what the projects will achieve. So we think it's going to actually accelerate projects and help us shift to this paradigm where we're pushing more funding to the regions, that the regions are then deciding on the projects.